This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Curtindo um podcast, né? Sabe o que você também vai curtir? Saber que o melhor flip de todos os tempos chegou. O novo Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 6, com Flex Cam, que tem zoom automático e faz selfies de 50 megapixels. E com bateria estendida para nunca te deixar na mão. Vá a uma loja ou saiba mais em samsung.com.br. Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 6. Galaxy AI chegou.
Welcome to the Japan on Film podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and welcoming a new guest today, and that is Sam Inglis. Sam, how you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you, Perry. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming on, and I'm glad you chose this movie. This is one of those movies that I put on the list because my wife actually picked it up, and I wasn't sure if anyone was actually going to want to come and pick this one. So I'm always glad when we get to go and revisit one of these kind of lesser known movies that people aren't as clued into. So it's a good way to kind of expose people to these types of things. But before we dive too deep into the movie discussion, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Well, as you said, I'm Sam Inglis. I've been talking and writing about movies for 25 years online now. And I've done a bunch of film reviews over at many different sites all across the internet, including some of my own. But at the moment, my main thing tends to be podcasting. I'm guesting on various things. I have my own show called Fearless Pretender, which is a filmography podcast about the character actress Jennifer Jason Leigh, who is my favorite actress of all time. My other main show is on hiatus at the moment, but we're coming back this year. That's called Hawk Talk, and as you might guess, is about Ethan Hawke. And we're sort of working our way through his filmography, myself and my friend Tim. And I do a lot of shows with my friend Super Marcy over at the Super Network. I've got my fourth episode of their exploitation podcast to start researching after we do this, pretty much.
Okay, so we'll try not to keep you too long today then, so you can get ahead and do that. So we talk about Japanese movies here. So what is your history with Japanese films in particular?
Yeah, you've already covered certainly one of the first things that I remember seeing. I think, like a lot of British kids of my generation, I was born in the early 80s, grew up as a film fan in the 90s. And I think, like a lot of British kids of that generation, the first things I saw were like Akira and Ghost in the Shell. And the first thing that made a real impression was Perfect Blue. For me, I really want to see the live action version of that at some point, just out of curiosity.
Just a side note, that is one of the movies I've got on my list. If you ever get a chance to find it, I am really curious to watch that as well.
Yeah, I would, as I say, I would love to find it. And then I don't know what the first sort of live action Japanese films that I got into were. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I started watching more foreign film in general in my mid to late teens, and I'm a wide-ranging film fan. I like to think, I try and see stuff from all over the world. But in the last couple of years, I seem to have sort of fallen into focusing on quite a bit of Japanese culture, and actually getting into it, to my surprise, from the end of music recently. During the pandemic, I stumbled on some really great bands. On my t-shirt today, I've got Kanami from Bandmade, who have become one of my favorite bands, along with a bunch of other to J-rock bands. And that's brought me back into a lot of Japanese cinema. Actually, of everything I've watched this year, for a reason that we'll talk about that's sort of connected to what we're doing on the show today, I've seen more films in Japanese than in any other language this year, including English.
Oh, wow.
Which is nuts.
Yeah, that even though I do this podcast, that still tops me.
So yeah, I've been sort of trying to chase a lot of stuff down, particularly on Sakura Ando, who we're and I will apologize in advance for any pronunciation problems. I am trying to learn some Japanese, but I am far from mastering any.
Well, at least on her name so far, you're on the right track, so don't worry.
Well, as I say, I've been trying to see a lot of her films. I saw Badlands on Netflix at the beginning of the year, and it just reminded me how good I think she is, and have since I saw Love Exposure way back. And I just decided I would try and see everything. And so far, I've watched 26 of her movies this year.
Wow, it's a lot, yeah. Yeah, I haven't seen as many of her movies. Like I saw her in, I think like most people, it was Shoplifters that drew me to her, and I started watching her because of that. And since then, like, I've seen her in Love Exposure. I saw her in this, and I think those are the only ones I've seen. I'm just looking. Yeah, these are the only ones I've seen. She is in Godzilla -1 though, which I still have to see. And I'm looking forward to seeing, but
yeah,
yeah,
I've got
she
that
is
to see yet. Sorry.
no, she's quickly becoming one of my favorite Japanese actresses as well. She's absolutely amazing in those three movies I mentioned. Like, she plays these very different characters in all three of them, and she's just gripping the entire time she's on screen in all three.
And yeah, for me, that's been a real fixture throughout what I've seen of her career, and I've still got quite a lot to go. I've got Godzilla -1 to see yet. I've already pre-ordered the American Blu-ray of Koreeda's new film Monster.
Oh yeah, I have to see that too. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. You're gonna say something else?
No, that's all good.
Okay. So yeah, so this was your first time watching this movie, right?
Yeah, first time I see it, so it was earlier this year. Yeah.
Okay, all right, yeah. Yeah, I saw this, we picked it up a few years ago, I think, my wife and I. I think this might have been before we were married even. But we'd already seen Shoplifters, and she saw this in the video store. She's like, "Oh, this is Sakura Ando from Shoplifters." I'm like, "Oh, okay, cool, let's watch it." And yeah, and I really, really found myself enjoying it, and really digging what was in here. What were some of your impressions the first time you watched this movie?
I think my sort of snappy line on it for Letterboxd and my Blue Sky account was if Rocky was a depressed Japanese woman. But what really drew me to it, and what really impressed me about it, and we'll get into this in some detail, I would expect, from my notes, was Ando's performance. And what I've always dug about her as a performer, and what is a real defining quality of this film, I don't know if we actually said the title. I know it's going to be on the episode, but of 100 Yen Love,
Right,
is the physicality with which she embodies all of her roles. I'm going to do another podcast. I'm planning another podcast that's going to launch with an episode about her. So I'll talk more about this on that show when that launches towards the end of the year. But she strikes me in the way she sort of physically embodies her characters as such an original performer. And that's what I really took away from this.
Yeah, she and my wife commented on this when we were watching it last night, the fact that she had apparently put on like she had gotten up, I think she had gotten like, she put on like 10 kilos of weight for the year, for the first part of the movie, when she's a bit chubbier. and then she took it all off to get down into her fighting shape over the course of filming. So she really went full method when she was preparing for this, which
Yeah,
I mean,
I
you see a
mean,
lot in American films. I don't think you see that as much in Japanese films. So it's very interesting that she did choose to go that route and put herself through that.
it's even more incredible than you think, though, um, because she had 3 months to prep. Apparently, I watched a Q&A from when the film was released. And apparently she had 3 months to prep. So in that time, she got ridiculously in shape, like, and did all the boxing training. Got totally in shape for the end of the film. Then put the extra weight on for the beginning of the film,
Ah, I see.
which she had on for the first 4 days of shooting, which was only 2 weeks long. And then she took that weight off across the 10 more days of shooting to get in shape for the end.
Wow.
It's one of the more extreme things I've ever heard about in terms of like method and changing your body for the film. And it's one of the most striking things in the movie, the way that she looks, not just in terms of her weight. I would never usually talk about an actress's weight to this degree, by the way, because there's no right weight for anyone to be or anything like that. But
Right.
it's such a defining thing about her performance. And you see right at the beginning, the director, let me pull the name.
Masaharu Take.
Yeah, so he, when you first see her, shows you her in a shot from behind where you just see her sort of scratching at some fat on her back. And you sort of get the idea of the kind of the fact that she's a bit out of shape. She's wearing very baggy clothes, her head's always down, hair over her face, she's very concealed. And she's not fat in, you wouldn't describe her that way, but
Right. Although
she's
in
clearly,
Japan they probably would. So I will say that. Like Japan's got
fair
a
enough.
Japan's got a massive fat shaming culture, which is one of the bad things about being here. But otherwise, yeah, you're right. Like by Western standards especially, I don't think anyone would call her fat.
But she's got some extra bulk, and her face looks very puffy in the first few scenes. She's really changed herself. And it gives that the way she holds herself, more than the shape of her, really puts across this sort of depressed, listless, disconnected feel, just through her body before she even speaks.
Yeah, and even without like, even before you get into the weight gain, just like the way she walks, she kind of like shuffles from place to place. She's um and not only is her hair like always like, hiding most of her face, but her she's almost like sulking the entire time she's moving around. Like everything she does, she's like sulking.
She said she also over bleached her hair, to make it look really terrible, for the beginning of the film.
Yeah, I noticed that as well too.
Yeah, um and so you wouldn't really expect this movie to be about a boxer when you're looking at somebody who is, as she is at the beginning of the film. But I wanted to ask a little about the title, because 100 Yen Love is about the fact that, sort of comes from the fact that she works in a 100 yen store, and that's like a dollar store, a pound store. Is that right?
So this is yeah. So we've got 100 yen stores in Japan are typically like they're like dollar stores, like Dollar Tree or Dollar General or whatever. I'm not sure what they're called in the UK, but in America there's like Dollar Tree, there's Dollar General, and they're basically very similar kind of things. They're much nicer in Japan. Most of them are. They're if you go to like the idea of like a dollar store I don't know about in the UK, but in America, the idea of a dollar store is always kind of associated with like low quality crap products. Um, it's actually they're actually pretty decent quality in Japan. There's some really nice things that they have there. I mean, like you can get like lots of lot of our stuff comes there. Like our kids are starting preschool next month, and we had to go out and buy like a whole bunch of stuff for their preschool supplies, and we picked up a lot of it at a hakin, we call it, 100 yen store. And there, but this one, I've never seen a store quite like this, because this isn't quite a dollar store. It's the name of the store is, also, let me just get this out of the way, the name of the movie. It's Hyakuen no Koi in Japanese, which is literally translated to 100 yen love. So that's one of the cases where the English and Japanese titles are completely in sync. And the store she works at is called Hyakuen Seikatsu, I think it was, which is basically like 100 yen life. And this store is more like a typical Japanese convenience store. So like 7-Eleven, or for people who've been here, Family Mart or Lawson or anything like that. But the fact that they've I'm not sure if these stores actually exist. I've never seen them here in my area of Japan or anywhere else I've been in Japan, but this seems to be like a combination of Japanese convenience store and 100 yen shop. So yeah, it's an interesting shop that they set up here that I've never seen something like this before.
Yeah, it made me think more of a sort of typical like mini supermarket or convenience store over here, the shop in the film. But we have an outlet called Poundland. But since the inflation crisis, I don't know if this has happened in the US so much, but since the inflation crisis, Poundland is basically a lie. There are a few like special offer items that are still a pound in Poundland, but it is not what it was, in that you used to walk in and everything was a quid.
Yeah.
And that's just stopped.
Yeah, we in Japan we have stores called 3 coins, which is supposed to be like, the idea was like they're 300 yen shops, so they're, it's a little bit more expensive than the 100 yen shops, a little bit higher quality. Although 3 coins can also translate to 3 different types of coins. They don't specify what the denomination is. So you have stuff that's like, 3 500 yen coins, so 1500 yen or something like that. So they kind of play around with the meaning of that a little bit. As I recall, and I didn't go to dollar stores a whole lot when I was living in America, but we went by a few times when we were visiting family last summer, and I believe most of the stuff in there is still about $1. I mean, maybe a little bit, or at least like under $10, I think.
So one of the things I really like about the way it uses the dollar store, the 100 yen store setting, sorry, is actually right at the beginning. It's the way the credits, I think, are really creative.
Yeah.
I mean, some of them you actually see on price labels that are stuck on the screen, but otherwise they're it's not as big and bombastic, but the way the sort of credits are slotted into the and superimposed on the shelves made me think of like the big credits superimposed over the city at the beginning of Panic Room, shrunk down to a very small idea of the same thing, but also like really creative and graphically really interesting. So one credit is completely different from the next.
Yeah. No, I can't remember if I had noticed the opening credits the first time I watched it, but I definitely clued into it this time around. And yeah, I love the way that they did that design of it. And the whole title of the movie it's an interesting thing, and I've been going back around. So ostensibly this movie, if you read like just kind of like the Cliff Notes version of it, or like a brief summary, the whole idea is that it's like they give you, it gives the impression that it's a boxing movie, right? It's even categorized as like a sports drama film, or like a sports romance film or something like that. The boxing element is there's a big climatic, there is a boxing match scene, but the whole boxing side of this is not really the whole story. The boxing thing is very kind of secondary to Ichiko Ando's character's growth. It's more like a metaphor as opposed to anything else.
Yeah, it's a catalyst for Ichiko growing into herself, I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah.
And I think, you first start getting glimpses of her interest as she's watching the boxing gym as she's cycling home. I think either from her interview at the 100 yen store or her first shift.
Hmm.
And the I think initially it's trying to say to us that her interest is in I'm pulling up
Yuji.
names again. It is in Hirofumi Arai's character Yuji,
Yeah.
rather than in boxing so much, because the focus remains on him rather than after his exercise. So it's sort of cluing us into it's probably him that she's first attracted to rather than the idea of boxing. Um, and obviously that relationship plays in different ways
Hmm.
throughout the film.
Yeah, and also I wanted to mention quickly about Hirofumi Arai because we're probably gonna give some praise for his performance, so we should probably get this out of the way. He was recently convicted of rape and sexual assault, so we're not in any way just wanted to let that known that this is a
Okay,
case of
I hadn't.
yeah.
Right.
This is I wanted to just make a mention of that. This is a case where we are definitely separating the actor, the art from the artist.
Yeah, I didn't know about that, of course. So yeah, wow.
Yeah, I didn't even realize I didn't even know about it either. And then we were watching it last night, and my wife had mentioned that he had gotten arrested recently. Apparently, there was this situation where he had called. So in Japan, they've got you know out call massage services, which
Mhm.
are basically covers for sexual services. But when you do the sexual service sides of thing, there's like all sorts of like rules that you're supposed to abide by. He broke those rules and he sexually assaulted and raped the masseuse, and then he ended up getting a prison sentence which got reduced because he paid something like 3 million yen in restitution to the victim. But yeah, really real scumbag.
So
um
I guess we'll just say this up front. His performance here is very interesting. It's very good. He's a very difficult character to read in a lot of ways, Yuji.
mhm,
Um, when he asks Ichiko out, she asks him why he did it, and he is very upfront with her and says, I didn't think you'd say no.
mhm,
Um, and he's sort of that kind of brash, dismissive guy throughout the film, really. Um, Kind of prickly and hard to get a handle on for her and for us, I think. And yet you are interested in him.
mhm.
Beyond that, fuck that guy, clearly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, also kind of fuck his character too, because like I think if one failing of this movie, I think, is that it's kind of implied by the ending that they're gonna end up together in some way, and he's just a total dick in like every
Yeah,
sense of the word. And I know and I think the film tries to maybe not justify, but in a way explain why he is the way he is, because he sees like one of these guys who is just completely um unable to get a handle on his life. Boxing seemed like the only thing in his life that he had, and now he's reached the cutoff age. So one of the big things in this movie is this idea of doing boxing as like an exercise thing or doing boxing for competition. And apparently in Japan, and I'm not sure how true this is or not, but there are age cutoff, and I'm not sure how it is in other places too, but there are age cutoffs for boxing. So for the men's division, it's like 37 is the cutoff age. Once you hit 38, you have to drop out. And then for the women, it's 32 is the cutoff age. So
mm,
uh, when when they're on the I can't remember if it's when they're on the date or when they're or after the boxing match that she goes to, but he says that yeah, I think it was after the boxing match. He says that this was it for him. This was the last time he was gonna be able to box because he's reached the cutoff age now. So now he has to go back go to work. And the her her scummy coworker asks, "Oh, so what is your work?" And he says, it's none of your business, right? He doesn't want to talk about what he does for a living, and we find out why. It's because he has no job. He's just kind of like a layabout jumping from like, low paying gig to low paying gig.
And woman to woman, it seems,
And woman to woman,
because
yes, yeah.
One of the key things with his character and the relationship with Ichiko is that he at some point meets a much younger woman who's selling tofu on the street, and he basically takes over that job and does it along with her, but takes over that job and clearly gets into a relationship with her and just leaves Ichiko behind after she's been letting him stay at her place and all of that. We're jumping all over, but there we go.
Well, that's okay. Yeah. I mean, this is a film where the plot of this film, it's not anything that's going to be very surprising to anybody. Like, I don't think the more important thing here is like the character growth she goes through. So jumping around is totally fine when we think about different things we want to focus on here. But you were about to say something else right before I cut you off. So why don't you go ahead?
No, that's okay. So I think that the other thing is you were talking about the cutoff ages, and I think that's important because one of the major points with Ichiko is that she's already 32 at the beginning of the film. And we should talk about that on two levels. There's a dynamic in her house. She's initially we find her living with her mother and her sister and her sister's son, and above a bento store. That's right, isn't it? Yeah. Above a bento store, and she and her sister Fumiko are just fighting all the time. It feels very teenage, actually. It reminded me quite a lot of the opening sequence of Lukas Moodysson's Fucking Amal, with two teenage sisters having a very petty fight over chocolate milk. And there's a sequence where Fumiko dumps ketchup all over Ichiko's hair, which reminded me a lot of that sequence. But I think it also her being in that position at that age, I feel she's a character who suggests to me that she has quite a lot of social anxiety. And there's a moment in an exchange in that sequence where Fumiko's sort of saying that she doesn't really look like a woman anymore, and Ichiko says, "Oh, I threw away my womanhood," and the reply is, "You can't get rid of it," implying that at 32 she's still a virgin, which comes up again later.
Yeah.
So in a certain way, obviously not in the same way as a teen movie, but in a certain way it's a coming of age film. Boxing helps her come out of her shell and sort of realize herself as an individual person for the first time, I think is one of the kind of key things about the film.
Yeah, I think so we should also mention this part here. One of the big triggers for Ichiko's development, which is something I've also got issues with in this movie, is the fact that she gets raped by her coworker, Noma. So she gets kicked out of her parents' house, or she decides to leave. It's like her mom, like during that big fight that you mentioned, like so kind of setting the stage here. Fumiko has just been divorced. She's got a son, and so she's moved back in with her parents. Ichiko has been living with her parents pretty much this whole time, because we find out when she goes to apply for the job at the convenience store, he's like, well, what was your previous work history? And she's like, oh, I was helping out at a family business. When we saw in the earlier scenes that she wasn't helping out at all. She's just, she's just laying about. She's basically, so in Japan, I'm not sure how much you know about the hikikomori subculture in Japan, but Okay, so
Not really anything.
all right, so basically it's shut-ins, people who are of like, extreme social anxiety. They lock themselves in their room, they never leave the house. I get the feeling that that was possibly to some degree that this described Ichiko, right? Because obviously she does leave the house. We see in the opening scene, like after it's late at night, and then she goes out to the convenience store to buy snacks and stuff like that. And it's implied that this is what she does for dinner a lot of the times because her mother says, "Don't go eating that junk you always buy." So, and she goes out and then she does exactly that. She buys like fish sausage and and chips and all this kind of like junk food, and that seems to be like the only thing she really eats these days. Um, and we never find out why she is this way, which suggests like it's been like something that's always been a part of her life. And um so they get into this big fight, her and her sister, and her mother, almost like, collapses while trying to stop them from fighting. Um, and she says to both of them in a fit of anger, get out, both of you get out. And then Ichiko's the one who says, fine, I'll leave. And so then Ichiko moves out on her own. She gets her own place, which surprisingly spacious place in Japan for a woman of her salary, I gotta say. Like it's an older
Yeah,
place, but it seemed like it was much bigger than I'd expect someone on her salary to be living in.
yeah, because it's I think it's specified that she's on like 1,200 yen an hour. Is that right?
Yeah, because she's working the night shift, so it's 1,200 yen an hour, and the manager mentions that it's something like it'll be about roughly around like $1,500 a month or so, which is it may sound like below poverty wages in America, but cost of living in Japan is generally lower. That's normal for like lower paid positions. So that's
Right.
but still like you wouldn't be able to afford. I'd assume like in a place we never find out what's I don't think they ever mentioned what city they're living in, but I imagine it's one of these, more rural type areas where it's a little bit cheaper to live. So but still like even so like I live in a one of those areas myself and it's that kind of salary would probably not be able to afford a place that is as big as that one is. So I was kind of surprised by that.
It's spacious, but I think you also get the feeling that it's like the term would be 1 LDK, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it seems like that. But even still, I wouldn't expect someone of her salary to be living in a 1 LDK. I'd be expecting them to live in like maybe a 1K or a studio apartment or something like that.
Right, right.
Um, but so that was just a side note about the living situation. But and I feel like one of the things this and then then she starts working at the convenience store. She's making this, this low salary and there there are a few different coworkers we see come in and out. There's a young guy who starts working there at some point. I think at one point we see some other guy there. But the two coworkers that we're really focused on are the manager and this really creepy older guy named Noma, who's never shuts up, right? And he's always kind of like creeping on Ichiko. And when they have an opportunity to go to see Yuji's boxing match because he doesn't have any cash with him, and so he tries paying with the ticket to his boxing match instead. Um, Noma says, "Oh, okay, let's go," and he takes her and he goes with her to the boxing match, and he's trying to grope her during the match and stuff like
Mm.
that. He's drinking a lot. They go out to dinner with Yuji later. He just keeps talking and talking and talking, um, and then Yuji ends up leaving, and when Noma and Sakura or Noma and Ichiko, sorry, her actress's name is Sakura, are when they're leaving, he he's very drunk and he basically forces her into a love hotel where he then rapes her. And in the process, she says, "This is my first time." Um, and I hate that scene. I just really hate that scene. I hate the idea of rape as catalyst for character development whenever it's used. I think it's just that's one thing
Yeah,
that's one problem I really had with this movie.
yeah. I'm not fond of it. I it's it if anything, it's just kind of a cliche as much as
Yeah.
anything, and a a horrible one to sit through, because unfortunately, one of the byproducts of Ando being as good an actress as she is that scene is really fucking hard to watch. It's really
Yes.
disturbing,
Yeah.
because the pain that she's putting across feels so real, you
Hmm.
know, as much as anything. And not that any rape scene isn't, difficult and awful to watch, obviously. Um, but yeah, what I do think that there's an interesting detail in that she calls the police before she leaves the room, but we never see any kind of follow up to that.
Yeah.
I
I
don't know
was wondering
quite
about that
what
too, because
goes
well,
on
yeah, that's
there.
what I was wondering too, because rape is a crime that is very underreported in Japan. Like, I mean, it's underreported everywhere, but especially so in Japan, and it's very often not taken as seriously as it should be. Like, I had known someone who had been involved in a sexual assault, who had been the victim of a sexual assault, and when she tried to report it, the kind of things that she was told was like they're asked like, well, you guys were drinking. Are you sure it was really non-consensual if you were drinking and all this kind of
Mm.
stuff? So there's a lot of rape apology going on in Japan.
I
So
will
there's
say
that.
this for the sequence, it doesn't engage in any of that.
Yeah,
It is
yeah,
extremely clear on what is going on and
yes,
how
yeah.
disgusting it is.
Yeah, but and the fact that they don't, I mean, we find out the next day when she goes back to work, because the manager says, well, he stole all this money because during the whole sequence he was saying he's like, "Oh, I've got money, I've got money, I've got tons of money today, I can pay you," and all this. And then the next day we find out that he actually stole all the money from the register before he ran out, and and then and she calls the police while he's asleep. She gives them the name of the hotel, and then she leaves. And the manager says, we don't know where he is. He's not at his place. He's not answering his phone. We don't know what's happened to him. So I f- I feel like the implication is that he managed to escape, because I feel
Yeah.
like if he had been arrested, there would have been something they would have been able to find out about this when he reports it to the police. So I feel like the implication is that the cops, they're like, oh, she's in a love hotel, maybe she's a prostitute and she got stiffed on payment or something like that, and maybe she's just trying to make up a story. So they just didn't take it seriously. I think it's a fit. I think it would have been good if we had some sort of follow up to get a clear image of what is happening there. But I think that's what's trying to be implied.
Yeah, I think so. And maybe the fact that it doesn't address it at all is, some level of commentary on how important the police think it is.
Mm,
Um, but, obviously that's not coming through particularly clearly. And it is sadly deeply ironic now,
yeah,
given what's happened with Hirofumi Arai.
yeah.
Um, you know, uh, and that scene comes actually after the first date between Ichiko and Yuji.
Hmm.
And I think that's an interesting sequence because it's definitely two people who um, have, have similar difficulties socializing, I think,
Hmm.
trying to have a date and not doing it particularly well. They have a very awkward walk around quite a dilapidated looking zoo. Um, and but I think again, it's one of the first times that you see a real shift in how Ando is presenting the character.
Hmm.
Um, because even with her so a clear social anxiety and awkwardness with people, she's definitely tried and dressed herself up for it. She's put a dress on, her hair is out of her face, she's wearing a little makeup maybe,
Hmm.
um, for the first time in the movie. Um, but I think the lack of confidence still comes through in that she holds herself to be quite small,
Yeah.
um, holds herself inward a lot, walking around the zoo as well. Um, and it's like these, you see this throughout the film. in pretty much every scene as we go on. Actually, particularly, and as you said, it's a shame that it has to come as a cat with the sexual assault, the rape as a catalyst. But particularly after that sequence, practically every scene we see some level of change in the way she physically embodies Ichiko and presents herself. Ichiko's physicality begins to change with practically every scene that goes by after that. And it's really interesting to watch the details of that shift. I actually, the first time I saw this film, and indeed the second, I had to watch it on a really bad, feed that I could just find online, and that was the only way I could get it with subtitles. And quite a lot of these films with subtitles, so it's the detail wasn't really there, but I got enough of what was going on, and I got the dialogue basically in my head. And then I found that there was a German Blu-ray to buy. Now, Germany is great for buying English language films from, because you've got the original soundtrack and they've got a lot of stuff that isn't on Blu-ray elsewhere. But it's not very good for foreign language films because they tend only to subtitle in German, which was the case with 100 Yen Love. But I thought, this film is so driven by physical performance, I'm just going to get it anyway because I want to see the details of that performance. So I went through it a third time yesterday and just looked at it, without having to pay attention to the dialogue really, and just purely looked at the physical performance and the physical changes that she goes through. And it's really instructive way to watch the film, actually.
That's very interesting. I could sorry, go ahead. Finish your thought.
Not understanding the language.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think we had a bit of a delay on Zoom here. But yeah, there have definitely been movies where I've had to do that before, or like when my wife's watching and it's a movie that either the subtitles won't work with two different ones with Japanese and English at the same time, or or something along those lines. And it is very instructive to watch a movie, especially one you've seen before, because you already know the story, because now you're just paying more attention to those performances. One thing I think is interesting about both Yuji and Ichiko, and I do wonder how much this is supposed to be kind of a commentary on, millennial lifestyle in Japan in general, because we've got this whole thing with Ichiko being a shut-in. Her daughter Fumiko is, she's divorced. She's a single mother now, and she's forced to live at home. Both kids are living at home, right? Basically, at the beginning. You've got, Ichiko is very, very kind of isolated. She's got all this social anxiety. She has difficulty communicating. This is a big thing we're seeing a lot of millennials these days too in Japan, where they're not always going into these traditional company salaryman, office lady type positions anymore, where now they are just doing more of the temporary part-time work, low-paying part-time jobs instead. And a big reason it's like kind of like a soft rebellion against the traditional Japanese work style due to the insane, lack of work-life balance going on. But also there's this idea of like, social anxiety of young people not having as much experience in dating and in sexual experiences. They tend to be much more introverted as opposed to previous generations. A lot of the stuff, there have been a lot of like stories about this, and some of it is typical, millennial bashing type stuff that you see in the West too. But there's also these are also some real issues that are happening, and a big part of it, which I think nobody in positions that could be in a place to do anything about it is really addressing, is the fact that the society isn't working for these people, which is why these types of things are being developed. And that date between them, or their whole like courtship, for lack of a better term, is just so bizarre, because it's just I mean, in Ichiko's case, I guess you could see why she finds him attractive, at least at first, right? He's in good shape, he's a good looking guy, so, and he's got this air of, you know, he's got this dispassionate air, this cool, the traditional meaning of cool about him. So there's that whole aspect of it. I can see her being attracted because of that. But for his part, I don't see what it is in Ichiko that he finds appealing other than the fact that, well, she's obviously taken with me, so this is going to be an easy lay or something like that is what it seems to be implied as. But that whole date they're on is just so strange because, she's talking to him in the car. He doesn't even get out of the car, right? He just pulls the car up and he just honks and then she gets in. She doesn't even notice him there, parked there at first. And then, and he doesn't say anything, right? They're not talking. They're just kind of sitting in silence. Then finally she asks, "Do you work at a gas station?" He says, "I used to." And then he just keeps, and then that's it. No follow up, nothing. They go to the zoo. They're just kind of like staring at the animals. He walks away without saying a word to her. Doesn't even, and she has to, she realizes he's walked away and she catches up to follow him. And there's no real connection between them that I can see. And so and I get the feeling that, maybe on her part, I understand, right? She's got this social anxiety. That's why she's not really, she's bad at communicating. And I think to an extent, maybe he does as well. Maybe he was one of these people who coasted on his athletic ability in school and stuff like that. And now that is kind of, because he's always been like, conventionally attractive and he's always been in shape. He's never had to deal with, meeting women based on his personality. So he never really developed much of a personality. Is kind of, because that also is implied with the tofu girl, who is at least a good 10 years younger than him, right? And they're on a smoke break, and she just kind of looks over at him and she's like, "You're cool," right? And so I get the feeling that that's kind of what it is. And then she left him once she realized that that's all he has going for him.
Yeah, because yes, as you say, we see him later, and he's no longer selling tofu. In fact, we see him going back to get bento from Ichiko's family store.
Mm-hmm. Well, the funny thing is how he got fired from the tofu stand. I'm not sure if you caught that little thing in the background, he sees her at the boxing gym and he leaves the tofu cart on the street. He's just walking up to her, and it's a really cool way they do the shot, because the camera is positioned from inside the gym, and it's with Ichiko in the foreground boxing, and then through the window in the background you see Yuji standing there on the street watching her, and the homeless guy who's friends. So there's this subplot where there's this woman who she used to work at the store. She got fired for stealing money from the store, and now she continually goes back to the store to grab their unsold food before they throw it out. And so, and Ichiko is always giving her the food. And there's one time when Ichiko is taking out the trash and she sees this woman, Ikeguchi, I think is her. Yeah, Ikeuchi is her name. And she sees her, with this other guy who's like, he's digging through the trash and stuff, and he's always like tipping his hat off. Now, taking it back to this scene when Yuji sees her at the gym, he leaves the tofu cart on the street. He walks over to go look at her in the gym, and it's the homeless guy. He comes over, he takes the cart, he tips the hat, and then he walks off with the cart.
I did miss that, but I'll tell you why. I was looking very intently at that shot, but I was thinking about it in another aspect, because basically what it is a complete reversal of the first time we see Ichiko looking at the boxing gym. Because when we see that first shot, it's again from the inside looking out, but it's sort of focused on her looking in and him at the punching bag, and then the roles are reversed, because this is very much towards the end of the film as she's training for her big fight, and so we see where he used to be in his element there. Now he's outside looking at her, sort of thinking that used to be me, rather than that could still be me, whereas she is suddenly in her element there. And it's like a complete turnaround in their fortunes and positions. So I was sort of thinking about it from that point of view and wasn't really looking at the background, maybe.
Yeah, I think I didn't even notice it the first time around, but this time around I definitely caught it. And then and my wife pointed out at a later point when I think when they're in the park after she comes to he comes to the bento store and sees her, and then he runs off. Um After they part at the park, the guy walks by with the tofu cart again and he tips his hat one more time.
We should talk about the boxing side of this, I think, because we haven't
Okay.
really touched on it very much. And it is kind of the key way that Ichiko develops as a character, and that Ando communicates the performance of the character, I think. So when she first goes in, um, at that point, I feel like there's still a listless feel to Ichiko. Um,
Mhm.
the first time you see her learning the boxing poses and things, her her arms are held in a way that feels very loose, like spaghetti arms. And maybe that's
Mhm.
partly inexperience, but it's also just this sort of heaviness of the character and the way she holds herself in
Mhm.
those early sequences. I've written down here limbs as loose as her clothes.
That's a good way of describing it.
Yeah, and but then she starts to train a bit more seriously once she gets together with Yuji,
Mhm.
and it's more, I think, the training that is giving her confidence rather than Yuji, which is why she doesn't really appear to care too much when he just disappears one day.
Well, it's not the
Uh,
training doesn't even the yeah, the she starts doing you're right, you're right. I'm kind of mixing up the timeline here. I think she really starts getting serious about it after he leaves. Well, it's
yes,
like the so it's I think what the big catalyst seems to be the rape scene and how she tried to fight back and she wasn't able to. And so I think that's like the big catalyst for her to join the boxing gym in the first place. And um well, at first I think she goes there to find Yuji because she does, the owner of the gym. I think it's Aoki Gym, so I assume he's Aoki. He comes in, he says, he's like, oh, well, you can, if you're interested, you can come train. It's good exercise, great way to stay in shape. And she asks about Yuji first, and he says, oh no, he quit. But then she goes in anyway, and she signs up to start going there. And
and
yeah, you're right. Sorry, I had
immediately
mixed up the
after,
timeline.
sorry,
Yeah,
and
yeah, and then
immediately on the first day asks if she can get a proper fight, a pro fight.
mhm.
Because I think the other thing that we didn't mention, which I think is really key from Yuji's boxing match, is he loses. He's not
Mhm.
like super impressive in that
Right.
sequence. Um, but what Ichiko is really engaged with, um, as much as she's engaged in watching him more than the fight, I think, at that point.
Mhm.
But what she really clicks with, I think, is the moment that the two guys sort of hug it out at the end, and particularly this very specific motion of I'm miming it for some
The
reason,
shoulder padding. Yeah, yeah.
a shoulder touch at the end of the match. And it's that thing, that moment of connection, that seems to be the thing that drives her to go into the gym, to feel that particular moment of connection, more than fighting, more than wanting to get in shape. It's like a fascination with why that happens, I think. It's
Mhm.
really interesting piece of writing. It's not a motivation I've seen before.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess this again comes back to that kind of lack of connection that there exists in a lot of millennials in Japan. So there's this generational barrier between the parents, the right. Obviously we see that other traditional types of relationships are breaking down. In the case of, again, looking back at Fumiko, her sister, she's divorced, and divorce has been rising in Japan and over in millennials compared to other generations. So there's a lot of this kind of stuff that's really kind of built into that. I think that this movie is kind of commenting on in Japanese society, and this lack of and people trying to find meaning in something else, right? The traditional what Japanese society tells you is the things you should be finding meaning in, and working, devoting your life for a company, getting married and having kids, and the whole, post-war nuclear family type setup. Younger generations aren't finding that fulfilling, or they don't think they'll find that fulfilling. And so they're looking for other things to find meaning in life, to find connection. And I mean, it's kind of telling that the Japanese society has gotten to this point where the only way people like Ichiko can find a connection is through punching someone in the face.
Yeah, I think, as I say, I think it's really interesting the way that sort of works its way through the film as a thread. And then each time she goes to the gym, I think we see a little change in Ichiko. The punches get tighter. At a certain point, the hair gets tied back out of her face, and never stops being tied back, even outside of the gym. And so it's every little detail. And the way Ando begins to change the way that she moves. So she starts jogging upstairs, and using her arms instead of letting them just hang. Even her voice gets a little deeper, a little more confident. And there's another moment about sort of midway through her training, just before, interestingly, just before Yuji decides to leave, where we see them have sex. And there's a nude scene for Ando. And, you could say it feels gratuitous, but what I think it's really about, in a certain way, is showing in a very upfront way how her body is changing.
Yeah. I mean, I think it does two things. I think yes, it is. You're right. It does do that as well. But another thing I think that scene is showing is also because it's this sex scene, but it doesn't feel particularly sexy, right? It's very kind of mechanical. And again, I think that speaks to the kind of lack of connection that they're both kind of feeling. And that's something that stood out to me. I'm just like, because especially if you compare it to Shoplifters. Remember the sex scene in Shoplifters? Like, that is a pretty passionate scene between Ando and Lily Frankie. But in this one, it's like the complete opposite. In fact, even in that one, I don't think, if I'm recall correct, like there was no nudity in that scene in Shoplifters either. But this one we even see that. This one we have some nudity here, but it just feels. And even though it's a sex scene, it's a sex scene that feels utterly sexless.
Yeah, it's very mechanical, like you say, and I think, speaks to that sort of dissonance between them, and why he, ends up leaving, because I think it's not particularly fulfilling for either of them. From that sequence. So throughout this, we get her doing the training, and then there's a moment where she has to go back and help out at home again. And I would skip over that a bit because it's not super important to the plot, but there's one like echoed scene that I think is really interesting in terms of how far the character has come. So in the very first sequence, when she's sort of scratching at that at her back, what she's doing is playing Xbox boxing with her like 7-year-old nephew, and because she's this kind of person, she's destroying him at it. She's not giving the kid a chance to beat her. And when she goes back, she starts teaching him actual boxing. And obviously she's not beating him up. So she is actually showing him properly. But then she's only doing that after having beaten him at Xbox boxing. So it's like, she's grown up a lot. She's more engaged with her family. She's teaching him something that's actually useful. But she's still kind of the fun aunt, and she still wants to beat him at Xbox,
Yeah. And another thing about that, and in another echo, because in that first scene, her mom kind of scolds her and says, like, if you're just going to stay around the house, least you could do is help out with your nephew. And she says, like, I'm with him more than anyone else. Like, yeah, but you're not exactly looking after him. You're just, playing video games with him and letting him eat junk food late at night against. So that's not exactly being much of a caretaker. But here she is, like you said, like, yeah, okay, so she's having fun with him and all that. But then, because she even comments in that first scene about how he gets beat up, right? He says, adults should go easy on kids. And she's like, well, this is why you get picked on so much in school, because you talk like that. And then, so she's not like giving him any sort of like, help on that side. And then in this way, she is saying, here, let me teach you what to do. Let me show you how you can do stuff. And yeah, I was worried for a second there. First time I saw this movie, I'm like, oh, I bet this is going to come back to haunt her. Like maybe he's going to get in a fight in school or something like that, and her sister's going to scold her about it and anything like that. But fortunately, it doesn't go down that route.
No, yeah, certainly if that does happen, it happens off screen.
Yeah.
So I guess that brings us to the fight, doesn't it?
Yeah,
pretty much.
Yeah, and one more thing I wanted to talk about, and this ties back to Ikeuchi, because I thought it was, I can't think of a better metaphor for late stage capitalism than this idea of, this, middle manager at, a low rent store, convenience store, getting so angry about the fact that they're giving food that is going to be thrown away anyway to homeless people, so much so that he tries locking it in lockers, he tries all these things, and eventually says, oh, we'll just throw it in the garbage bag first before we give it to her. And then and like, I mean, like, that's just like, it is so absurd on its face. And it's just like, but this is how it works in restaurants, in grocery stores, everywhere, where it's like, we're throwing this food out. The homeless people can't have it, right? It's just utterly bizarre when you think about it. And the fact that this is the time when she decided to just punch the shit out of that guy. I love that was that moment. Yeah, and then to top it all off, when she leaves and then she sees Ikeuchi, and Ikeuchi is like, he's like, oh, she's like, how are you doing tonight? And I like, she says, bye nada, like combining sayonara with bye, goodbye. And then she says to her, and Ichiko says, I'm sorry, I got fired. I can't give you food anymore. And Ikeuchi is like, oh, that's okay. I've got it handled. Then she takes out a butcher's knife and she goes in and she robs the register. And then she comes out and she taps Ichiko on the head one more time and gives her a coin for her help.
I like that we only see the robbery from outside, but we do get to hear the guy at the till going, really?
Yeah.
Which I think is one of the funnier moments in the film. I was going to ask about the Bainara thing, whether that's just her or whether that's some sort of contraction that's just that her. People actually use. Okay, okay, cool.
Yeah, that's just her.
Yeah, I hadn't heard it before, and with the way that English is sometimes incorporated into a lot of foreign languages, it
is incorporated in Japanese in a lot, and there are like a very common goodbye in Japan is just bye bye, and so there is a lot of that. Japanese uses a lot of loan words from English, especially. So, but that one is not one of them. That's just her own portmanteau that she made up, and it's a nice little character quirk.
Yeah.
Just a side note on that actress too. I just found this out as I was opening up these pages to have notes and stuff nearby. But that is Toshie Nagishi. She was also in Audition. If you've ever seen Audition, the Takashi Miike film. But in that she plays like the kind of housekeeper in it. So it's very funny because I could see like she's a little bit familiar, but completely different character. Like, you talk about someone who definitely kind of disappears in the role. She definitely disappears into the role of Ikeuchi in this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really fun performance, and also what you were saying about the thing where he insists on putting them in the rubbish bag, putting the food in the rubbish bag before giving it to her. It's just like one of those little moments that is so true about the way that we want to just dehumanize homeless people even before helping them. It's just messed up.
Yeah. But anyway, so now we can go on to the boxing. So what would you want to say about the boxing match?
Well, yeah, I mean, this movie isn't Raging Bull, so it's not
Mhm.
like the boxing match isn't like the most creative sequence in the film or anything like that. But there's a lot going on in terms of character growth. But I think the first thing that we have to note is what Sakura Ando looks like
Mhm.
in this sequence. And the first time we see her, she's cut her hair short, and we can see finally what kind of shape she got into for the
Mhm.
movie, which is ridiculous. I mean, she didn't get big, but just really
She is
lean.
extremely, yeah, she's very, lean in that scene. Like it's such a contrast to that first scene.
It's
And so like
crazy that she did that in 10 days. I just cannot imagine what she put herself through for those 10 days of filming.
I was also looking at her face, like just like, and I was like stunned several times because she looks completely different, like with the short hair and just like the even like the determined look on her face, like everything about her. If you would show me, I think if you had shown most people still photos of the before and after, I think you'd get a good chunk of people who would say like, oh yeah, those are different people.
Yeah, yeah, it's crazy. As I say, I just do not know how she pulled it off. It's incredible, the
Hmm.
contrast. But there are only two reasons in a movie that anyone cuts their own hair. It's trauma and empowerment. And this is kind of a bit of both, but mainly the
It is,
latter.
yeah.
Um, uh, I think the key thing about the haircut though is that she's already stopped hiding behind her hair
Well,
by tying it up, but
that
this sort of takes away that option.
exactly. That's something else I was going to mention too. Like the fact that, all this time she has been hiding her face, hiding her body, right? In these with the long hair, like we've talked about in the beginning, and with the really baggy clothes. She sheds all of that. Like even when she gets in shape, like she's wearing clothes that are a little bit closer to her size, but still, covering her up a pretty fair bit. This time, she's just, she sheds it all, right? Her hair is very short. She's just wearing a sports bra and shorts. And granted, it's a boxing scene, so obviously, but it does
Yeah,
provide a very stark contrast to that first scene we see her in.
yeah, and let's just say her trainers, though they definitely like her and respect the journey that she's been on, are not the most encouraging. The last thing that one of them says to her is, "Try not to get your face ruined."
I mean,
Um,
I think you could definitely say that with the older guy, with the guy who I think is I'm calling him Aoki because that's the name of the gym. But the younger guy, I think he's a little bit more understanding of her, even if he just doesn't come out and say it, verbalize it so much. But he's like but like anytime she comes in asking, he's always kind of like, giving the old guy a little bit of a look. So it kind of suggests that it's like, "Yeah, you're my boss, but I don't really agree with you on this." So
hmm.
I think on his part, we see a little bit more compassion towards Ichiko.
So, what do you think of the way that the boxing sequence is staged and shot?
Um, Honestly, I didn't put too much thought into that because at this point in the movie, I'm just more clued into, and I'm not a fan of boxing of sports movies in general. So, like when we get to the boxing scene and all that, I'm just kind of like, you know what, I want to get more back to the family drama and all the stuff that's more interesting to me. But um I thought it was just interesting that they put her up against this. Basically, they put her in an unwinnable situation because it's like this four-time champion or something. I think they said she was
Mm.
her opponent, and she only got in because the other person who was supposed to fight got injured. So it's just like,
Another parallel to Rocky. That.
yeah, yeah. Um, and also another parallel to Rocky is that she ends up losing at the end too, which
Yeah, I
and
mean,
that's
it's a bit of a rout. In fact, she's
mhm.
not even really particularly competitive for most of the fight. She's
No,
getting her face beat in. You know.
yeah, I mean, like there's a moment when she finally uses because they've been talking about the left hook, her left hook throughout the entire movie, and there's one point in the movie when in that match when she finally gets to land a left hook, and then you think it's going to turn one way, and then the other boxer, she just knocks her out with like an uppercut or something like that, and
Yeah,
that's it for her.
literally
And
the
she's
second after.
right. And then what I really like what they did here, because they have that. It's very similar to the Captain Marvel sequence, if you've seen that movie, when she's kind of standing up and it's all these flashbacks to all the times when she stood up again at the end. And here it's almost like the opposite, because you see all these times when she was beaten down and all this, and then she finally gets up and she's ready to win. And they're like, the match is over. What are you doing?
Yeah. Um,
But I think
but
that did a good way of showing just like how chaotic that situation is when if you're in the boxing match, is that like, after you've just been knocked down to the ground, you get up, and for you, no time has passed, right? But for everybody else, like obviously, it's been, however, at least a minute or so has passed in real time. So, but she's still she's so much in that mode, and her mind hasn't caught up to the reality yet. So I thought that was a good way of showing that aspect of it.
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things about the fight sequence. First of all, I mean, it's hard to tell because, cutting can be very clever and things like that, but it does appear at certain points to just be a real fight. The punches do not look pulled, and it looks like Ando took some really pretty big shots in that sequence. I wouldn't be surprised if she got pretty hurt. But for me, as much as anything, it's not the actual fighting during the rounds that's the interesting thing in that sequence. It's the stuff in the corner between. It's the look on her face, the determination, and the pain and the shock as well. Particularly after round one, she's like completely dazzled by what's been going on, but there's just grit there as well. And then in round two, you get the trainers in the corner saying to her, if you're going to go down, make a splash, which kind of feels like the mission statement of the movie to me.
Yeah. Yeah, and she does, and in a way she does. One of the things that struck me too about the boxing scene was what happens right after, because everybody's applauding her, and Fumiko, her sister, almost looks confused and like maybe a little bit surprised why everyone is applauding her. It's kind of like, I'm not sure. How did you read that? If you notice if you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think throughout the fight, you see her wanting her sister to do better in the fight. You see her wanting her not to be getting beaten up, and maybe that's confusion about like, but she did what we thought she was going to do. She lost, and badly. Why are people applauding her for losing badly, sort of thing?
Yeah.
And, it's a little hard to read. As much as that's a good performance from, I think the actress just goes by a single name. Is it Saori? Saori.
Yeah. Although in Wikipedia they say they have her full name here, Saori Koide. But yeah, I think in the actual one, yeah, it's just Saori in the official credits.
But of course, the key moment of the fight and what it all comes back to isn't the fight, isn't the corner. It's thanking her opponent and getting that shoulder touch. And she wanted to experience it from the other end, from the winner's end, I think. And what's interesting about that moment is like, I don't feel like we get any clarity on it in a way, and yet it's still satisfying. I don't think even even she understands why she wanted to experience that moment, but the film still gives it weight, feels the weight of it, and it still feels significant to her.
Yeah, and she keeps thanking her too, the boxer. And something I was wondering too is like, I wonder if maybe this was the only time that Ichiko really felt alive, right? Because throughout most of it, she's throughout everything else that she's supposed to feel, that is supposed to give her life meaning, like none of it means anything to her. But this gives her meaning. This is where she feels passion. This is where she feels excitement. This is where she feels all these emotions that a human is supposed to feel.
Yeah. And then in the dressing room, we see kind of old habits dying hard because she's looking at her face in the mirror and inspecting the bruises and trying to hide them with her hair, even though the hair's not there anymore.
Yeah, yeah. But then we get the final scene with Yuji, and she breaks down and she says, like, I wanted to win just once in my life. I wanted to win. And I think that's really kind of like what the whole thing is, like, just again going back to this idea of like the generation being put down upon and all that and not being able to get ahead. And the fact that she ends up going with Yuji at the end, like, I understand the message that the film is saying is like, well, she's just going back to what is comfortable. She's just taking what little she can get. Maybe he's changed a little bit now that they've both been through this experience, but still, I don't really get the sense of any sort of what's the word I'm looking for. I don't get the sense that he's really like there. I don't get the sense any sort of redemption or even like a desire for redemption in his character at all. So it just feels it ends on it leaves a bad taste in my mouth.
Yeah. I understand that. I don't know that it entirely suggests to us that they're going to get back together, though. I think in a way, in some ways, for me, it's more about in that moment, he's the only person who understands what she's going through, and he's the only person that she can possibly cry to, and she needs to cry in that moment. She needs that release, because as much as the fight was the point and the getting up after taking a beating was the point, she did also want to win and thought she could.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, I guess part of me just really wishes she would have punched the guy for being such a dick all this time.
Yeah.
I think that would have been a good way to show, like, I finally won something.
Yeah, the prize of getting to punch him. Yeah, I could go for that. Particularly, given the givens. I also today, just as background and sort of to look at a movie that looked at similar things a decade on. I rewatched a film called Small, Slow but Steady. And just to give a shout out to that, which is about a real life Japanese female boxer who is deaf.
Oh, okay.
And that is yeah, so I mean that's a true story. It's set largely it's set during the pandemic, during the lockdowns in 2020. But she's still training and having fights because it's sort of the tail end of the lockdowns. And that's a very good film with a very good central performance by Yukino Kishi.
Okay.
I don't know any more of her work, but probably worth looking out for. And if you find 100 Yen Love to be interesting, it's a very different film, but looking at some similar things and also dealing, I think, maybe more elliptically with some level of depression in its central character. So yeah, I think it's worth checking both of those out sort of on a similar theme.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, people should definitely go check that out yet. And but I think that's a good note to end on. So Sam, thank you so much for coming on. This is a lot of fun to go back and revisit this movie. I think we had a very interesting both had interesting things to say about it. But why don't you tell us a little bit more about why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, well, I'm on Blue Sky and Letterboxd as 24 FPS UK. You can check me out there. As I say, I'm fairly often on podcasts on my friend's website, the Super Network. by the time this drops, I should have recently had an episode come out on the exploitation star Christina Lindbergh. She was in a film called Sex and Fury over there, and a couple of others. Though that's not one of the ones we're discussing on this episode. And I also do Fearless Pretender, which has its own Blue Sky account that I run over at JJL Pod on Blue Sky. But if you watch my account over there, you'll be able to find information on all the kind of stuff that I'm doing pod wise and writing wise as and when I get to that.
Okay, great. So we'll have links in the show notes, so please go make sure and check those out. That does it for this episode of Japan on Film. JapanOnFilm.com is the website, and we are Japan on Film on Threads, Blue Sky, and Instagram, so please make sure to follow us. We are also part of the Film Stories Podcast Network, so please make sure to check them out at filmstories.co.uk and listen up after the credits to hear what's coming up next on the network. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. The Japan on Film podcast is produced by me, Perry Constantine, in conjunction with the Film Stories Podcast Network. Visit JapanOnFilm.com for show notes, episodes, and information about being a guest yourself. You can also reach out to me on the website's contact form if you have questions or comments about Japanese movies or the show itself. The show is at Japan on Film on Threads, Blue Sky, and Instagram, so please be sure to follow us. If you'd like to support the show, you can donate on JapanOnFilm.com, purchase from our advertisers, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Join the Film Stories Podcast Network Discord from the link in the show notes to connect with me and many other cinema fans and podcasters.
Britain. Fish and chips, cups of tea, the smell of the theatrical grease paint, the roar of the football crowd. A diverse nation grappling with its own long, complex history, always with one tongue firmly in cheek. Over the last century, British film has ebbed and flowed, from Ealing comedy to carry-on sauciness, from the British New Wave to Cool Britannia, from Hammer Horror to Hammer Horror again. Forget Hollywood, embrace Pinewood. I'm AJ Black, author, writer and podcaster, and I love British film. Join me in a celebration of its quirks, its successes, its failures, and its unique gems at the Pictures in Britain. Please find and subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your podcast player of choice. Find the podcast on Linktree, linktr.ee/at the Pictures in Britain. And check out the Film Stories Podcast Network at www.filmstories.co.uk. See you at the Pictures.